What if I told you that nearly everything you take for granted in your world, your laws, your philosophy, the way your government is structured, the plays you watch, the medicine that saves your life, the mathematics that built the satellites above your head, all of it traces back to a collection of sun-baked hillside villages in southern Europe, populated by people who had no idea they were about to change the human race forever? They had no standing army at the start, no unified nation, no emperor. What they had was something far more dangerous: ideas, and the absolute refusal to be told what to think. They called themselves Hellenes. We call them the Greeks. In the span of roughly 1,000 years, from the collapse of the Bronze Age around 1100 BCE to the final absorption of Greece into the Roman Empire in 146 BCE, these people would invent democracy, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, geometry, biology, epic poetry, naval warfare, the marathon, and the very concept of Western civilization itself. But this is not just a story of triumph. It is a story of unimaginable violence, of cities burned to ash, of entire populations sold into slavery, of brilliant men exiled or executed for thinking too clearly, of a civilization that nearly destroyed itself twice before finally being swallowed whole by the empire it had inadvertently created. This is the complete story of the Greek Empire, from the very first settlements to the very last gasp. Sit down, you're going to want to see this. To understand where Greece came from, you have to understand what vanished before it. In 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was dominated by interconnected Bronze Age civilizations: the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians in North Africa, the Phoenicians in the Levant. These were sophisticated palace economies that traded grain, copper, tin, textiles, and wine across hundreds of miles of open sea. And then, in the space of about 50 years, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, virtually all of them collapsed. Palatial centers burned, trade networks vanished, writing systems were forgotten, urban populations dropped by as much as 90% in some regions. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and to this day it remains one of the most debated catastrophes in ancient history. The causes were almost certainly multiple and interconnected. A decades-long drought documented in recent geochemical studies of lake sediments in Turkey and Cyprus. Disruptions caused by the mysterious Sea Peoples, groups of displaced migrants and raiders who destabilized coastal regions from Egypt to the Aegean. Possible earthquakes, and cascading systemic failures as trade networks that had sustained everyone snapped apart. For the people living through it, it must have felt like the end of the world, because it was. The Mycenaean civilization, the world of Agamemnon, Achilles, and the Trojan War, collapsed almost completely. The palace at Mycenae was burned and abandoned. Linear B, the Mycenaean writing script, disappeared. The population of Greece shrank dramatically. Villages replaced cities. What followed is called the Greek Dark Ages, and it was genuinely dark. For roughly 300 years, Greece existed in a state of fragmentation, poverty, and near illiteracy. Population levels dropped. Long-distance trade essentially ceased. People clustered in small, subsistence farming communities, herding goats on rocky hillsides, occasionally raiding neighboring villages. But something interesting was happening in the darkness. Iron technology, which was just becoming widespread in the Mediterranean, began to replace bronze. Iron was more abundant, cheaper to produce, and could hold a sharper edge. Suddenly, farming tools improved. Weapons became more accessible. You no longer needed a palace economy and international copper-tin trade routes to arm your soldiers. And crucially, iron democratized violence. In the Bronze Age, sophisticated armor and weapons required state-level resources to produce. With iron, individual craftsmen in small villages could produce functional swords and spear tips. This had profound long-term consequences for Greek military and political culture. The other thing happening in the Dark Ages was memory. Oral poets, bards, called aoidoi, were preserving and elaborating on the stories of the Bronze Age collapse. The great deeds of Mycenaean heroes, the siege of Troy, the wandering of Odysseus. These stories were passed down through generations, evolving, growing, being performed at aristocratic feasts and religious festivals. Sometime in the late 8th century BCE, these stories crystallized into the works we now call the Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to a poet named Homer. Though scholars have debated for centuries whether Homer was a single person, a tradition, or a compilation. Whatever Homer was, these poems became the foundational texts of Greek civilization. The Iliad especially, with its unflinching portrayal of war, heroism, pride, loss, and mortality, defined Greek values for the next 1,000 years. Around 800 BCE, something shifted. The population started growing again. Trade networks re-emerged, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet, one of history's most consequential borrowings, and adapted it to their own language, adding vowels to create a writing system that was radically simpler and more accessible than the old linear B syllabary. With writing came record-keeping. With record-keeping came law. And with law came the first fragile steps towards something revolutionary: the idea that power should be governed by written rules that applied to everyone. The basic political unit of this new Greece was the polis, the city-state. And this is crucial to understanding everything that followed. Greece never unified into a single nation in the way that, say, Egypt or Persia did. Instead, it consisted of hundreds of independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Miletus, Syracuse, and many more, each with its own government, laws, currency, and identity. This fragmentation was both Greece's greatest strength and its ultimate fatal weakness. It created a competitive, innovative environment where different political and social experiments could run simultaneously. But it also meant that Greece would spend enormous energy fighting itself, energy that could never be fully directed outward. As Greece's population boomed in the archaic period, city-states faced an old problem: not enough farmland. The Greek landscape, rocky and mountainous, was never particularly fertile. Cities faced stark choices. They chose both, but the colonization movement was extraordinary in scale and consequence. Between 750 and 550 BCE, Greek city-states founded colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Corinth established Syracuse in Sicily, which grew to be one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Miletus founded over 70 colonies. Greeks settled in modern Spain, France, Italy, Libya, Turkey, Ukraine, and Georgia. These weren't random migrations. They were carefully organized expeditions led by a designated founder. They established new polis with constitutions, laws, and religious cults, often innovating beyond the founding city. The colonial movement spread Greek language, culture, and commerce across an enormous geographic area. It created a Mediterranean world where Greek-speaking merchants found familiar institutions and trading partners. Commerce was absolutely central to the archaic Greek world. Corinth became fabulously wealthy. As a commercial and manufacturing hub, pottery, textiles, and metalwork flowed outward. Grain from Egypt and the Black Sea flowed in. Coinage transformed this commerce. It created a more fluid and scalable system of exchange, adopted from Lydia around 600 BCE. Commerce also created a new class of wealthy non-aristocrats, disrupting the old order. Political power and social status once came from inherited land and lineage. But a merchant or craftsman could accumulate considerable wealth without noble blood. And wealth, as it tends to do, eventually demanded political representation. This tension created the conditions for a phenomenon the Greeks called tyranny. A tyrant was someone who seized power outside of established constitutional norms. Many early Greek tyrants were actually popular, effective rulers. Cypselus of Corinth broke the Bacchiad aristocracy's stranglehold, presiding over commercial growth. Pisistratos of Athens sponsored public works, expanded festivals, and promoted farmers' interests. The tyrannies were a transitional phase, breaking aristocratic power without creating lasting change. Most tyrannies lasted only a generation or two before collapsing into oligarchy or something new. Before Athens's great experiment, we need to understand Sparta. You cannot understand Greece without understanding its two radically different answers to society. Sparta solved its land problem in the 8th century BCE by conquest, not colonization. They subjugated their neighbors, the Messenians, enslaving them as helots, The Helots vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters, controlled by constant, systematic terror. This security requirement shaped every aspect of Spartan society. The agoge, the brutal state education system, took boys from their families at age 7. It subjected them to years of hardship, physical training, and semi-institutionalized violence. This wasn't just about creating good soldiers, but soldiers who could suppress internal revolt. The Crypteia was one of the most chilling Spartan institutions. Each year, promising young men were sent out to kill strong, dangerous-looking helots. This served as a practical cull of potential revolt leaders and a training exercise. Spartan women had more freedom and status than women in most Greek city-states. They could own property, received physical training, and managed estates while husbands served. But Spartan society was profoundly anti-intellectual, conservative, and designed to resist change. The Spartan military machine, however, was simply the best in the world. A Spartan hoplite trained for war from childhood and lived a semi-military life. Spartan units held their formations with a discipline other Greek armies could not match. The Greek phalanx was one of military history's great innovations. It arose directly from the social and political changes of the archaic period. The hoplite was an armored infantryman named for the hoplon, the large circular shield. His kit included a bronze or iron helmet, breastplate, greaves, and a thrusting spear. The key tactical innovation was the phalanx, a dense formation of hoplites. Standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward in a bristling wall. Cohesion was everything. Each man's shield protected himself and the man to his left. A man who broke formation exposed the man to his left to attack from the unprotected right side. Hoplite warfare had profound social implications. Equipment was expensive. Hoplites were drawn from propertied middle classes, farmer citizens with enough wealth. These men who shed blood for the city expected political rights in return. The phalanx and broader political participation were deeply connected. Athens in the early 6th century BCE was in crisis. The old aristocracy controlled everything. Small farmers faced debt and enslavement, leading to explosive social tension. In 594 BCE, Athenians appointed Solon as archon, giving him unlimited authority. Solon's reforms were sweeping. He cancelled debts and freed those enslaved for debt. He reorganized citizen classes by wealth, not birth, and gave all male citizens assembly rights. Solon didn't create democracy, but he created the preconditions for it. Cleisthenes completed the project in 508-507 BCE, revolutionizing Athenian politics. He reorganized the citizen body into 10 new tribes, breaking old aristocratic networks. He created the Boule, a council of 500, serving as a steering committee for the assembly. Every adult male Athenian citizen gained the right to participate directly in the ecclesia. This was democratia, people's power, not representative, but direct democracy. Most offices were filled by lottery, not election, on the theory that any competent citizen could serve. Cleisthenes also introduced ostracism, a democratic safety valve against tyranny. Citizens could vote to exile any individual who became too powerful for 10 years. While Greece was working through its internal contradictions, a world empire was rising to the east. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BCE, was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from modern Pakistan in the east to Thrace in the west, governing 50 million people under a sophisticated administrative system. The Persian Empire was not the cartoonish tyranny that Greek historiography has often made it. It was, by ancient standards, relatively tolerant. Cyrus famously respected the religions and customs of conquered peoples, using local elites to administer territories. But it was also an absolute monarchy where the great king's will was law, and subjects prostrated themselves before him. The collision between Persia and Greece was inevitable given geography. The Greek cities of Ionia fell under Persian rule. These cities chafed under Persian-appointed tyrants and heavy tribute demands. At the end of the 6th century BCE, the mightiest empire was marching towards squabbling city-states. The Greeks were outnumbered, divided, and by any rational calculation, doomed. Yet something was about to happen. In 499 BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia rose in revolt against Persian rule, instigated by Aristagoras of Miletus. His motives were personal as much as political, seeking survival after a failed military expedition. Aristagoras sailed to mainland Greece for help. Sparta's king Cleomenes the Rhine turned him down cold. When Aristagoras mentioned Susa was 3 months' march, Cleomenes simply said, "Leave Sparta before sunset." Athens was more receptive, sending 20 ships. Eretria sent 5. It was enough to provoke an enormous Persian reaction. The Ionian revolt burned for 6 years. Greeks scored early successes, including the burning of Sardis. But ultimately, Persian resources were too vast. At the Battle of Lade, the Persian fleet destroyed the Greek naval coalition. Miletus, the great intellectual and commercial hub, was sacked and its population dispersed. Darius the Fine of Persia did not forget the Athenian and Eretrian intervention. He commanded a servant to whisper, "Master, remember the Athenians." In 490 BCE, Darius dispatched a force across the Aegean, a punitive expedition to destroy Athens and Eretria. The force, commanded by Datis and Artaphernes the Younger, numbered perhaps 25,000 soldiers in 600 ships. They first sacked Eretria, selling the population into slavery, then landed at the Bay of Marathon. The Athenians had roughly 9,000 to 10,000 hoplites, plus 1,000 Plataean allies. Spartans were delayed by a religious festival. The strategic genius of the campaign was Miltiades, who understood Persian tactics better than his colleagues. The Persian force was larger and their cavalry formidable, but the cavalry appears to have been absent. The Athenians chose this moment to attack. What happened next was tactically brilliant. The Greek phalanx advanced at a run, minimizing time under Persian arrow fire. The Greek center was weakened, the wings strengthened. The Persian center pushed through the thin Greek middle, but found itself surrounded as the stronger Greek wings wheeled inward. The Persian force, attacked from 3 sides, broke and fled to the ships. Athenian casualties, 192 dead. Persian casualties, approximately 6,400. The numbers tell the story of the battle's one-sidedness. After the battle, the Athenians force-marched back to Athens to defend the city against the Persian fleet's flanking movement. They arrived before the Persians could land. The Persians, seeing the army in position, turned away. The legend of Pheidippides, the runner who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce victory and then dropped dead, is a later invention. But it gave us the modern marathon race and one of history's most enduring athletic metaphors. Marathon's significance extended far beyond the battle itself. It proved that the Persian army could be beaten by Greek infantry. It gave Athens an enormous psychological boost and a myth of special destiny. And it persuaded the Athenians to dramatically expand their navy, a decision that would save all of Greece a decade later. The hero of the Persian Wars in some ways wasn't a general at all. It was an Athenian politician named Themistocles. He was one of the most consequential strategic thinkers in ancient history. He argued relentlessly that Athens' future lay at sea. In 483 BCE, Athens discovered a rich vein of silver at the Laurian mines. The conventional proposal was to distribute the windfall. Themistocles argued instead for building 200 new triremes, the fast, oar-powered warships that were the apex naval technology. The trireme was a technological marvel. Roughly 120 feet long and 20 feet wide, it was powered by 170 oarsmen. It could achieve speeds of perhaps 7 to 9 knots in sprint and maintain 6 knots for extended periods. Its primary weapon was a bronze ram. Trireme combat was less like modern naval warfare and more like chariot racing, all about speed, maneuverability, and timing. The standard tactic was the diekplus, rowing through the enemy line and then turning to ram their exposed sides. Training trireme crews to this level of efficiency required enormous investment of time and money. Athens, uniquely among Greek states, could afford it and had the population base to crew the ships. The 200 triremes Themistocles built became the core of Greek survival. After Darius died in 486 BCE, his son Xerxes spent several years suppressing revolts in Egypt and Babylon. He then turned his full attention to Greece. This was not a punitive expedition, but a full imperial conquest. Ancient sources give wildly inflated numbers, but modern estimates suggest 200,000 to 250,000 troops and 1,200 warships. This was an almost incomprehensibly large force for the period, demonstrating extraordinary preparation. Xerxes had 2 pontoon bridges constructed across the Hellespont, a narrow strait about a mile wide. When storms destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes famously ordered the sea to be whipped and branded as punishment. Engineers were beheaded and new ones brought in. The final bridges used hundreds of ships lashed together with thick cables. The Greek response was complicated by political divisions. Many cities submitted without a fight, called medizing. A group of states formed the Hellenic League under Spartan leadership, but those who medized were regarded with contempt. The plan was to delay the Persian advance long enough for the Greek fleet to engage the Persian navy. The Greeks chose Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a narrow coastal pass where mountains met the sea. Only a few men could fight abreast, making it an ideal defensive position. The Greek force at Thermopylae numbered roughly 7,000 men, under the command of Leonidas I, king of Sparta. The famous 300 were the Spartan royal bodyguard, joined by 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and other contingents. The 300 Spartans are remembered for dying to a man, as did the 700 Thespians, an equally extraordinary contribution. For 2 days, this small force held the pass against repeated frontal assaults by the Persian army. The phalanx was unbreakable from the front. Persian arrows couldn't penetrate shields and armor at short range. Superior Persian numbers were useless if only 100 men could engage at once. The pass was betrayed on the 3rd day. A local man named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path. This path would bring them out behind the Greek position. Leonidas, hearing this, dismissed most of the Greek force. He and 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans remained. They died in the last stand. The Spartans' last stand has echoed through 25 centuries. It was a deliberately chosen death. The oracle at Delphi had told Leonidas that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. He chose the king's death. The epitaph on the monument later erected at the site is one of history's most haunting inscriptions. Leonidas had the chance to retreat and fight another day. Instead, he chose to die at Thermopylae. Was his sacrifice the act of a selfless patriot, or a commander who threw away his best men for a symbolic gesture? After Thermopylae, the Persian army swept through central Greece. Athens was evacuated. The entire civilian population, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 people, was moved to Salamis and other friendly territory. When the Persians arrived, they found the city largely empty and burned it, including the temples on the Acropolis. The decisive battle of the Persian Wars was fought at sea. The Greek fleet faced a Persian fleet in the narrow strait of Salamis. Themistocles chose this location deliberately. In the confined strait, Persian numerical advantage would be neutralized. Themistocles also sent a secret message to Xerxes, warning him that the Greek fleet was planning to scatter and escape. Xerxes obliged, sending ships to block the exits overnight, exhausting his crews. In the morning, the Greek fleet attacked. The Battle of Salamis was a catastrophe for Persia. In the confusion of the narrow strait, larger Persian ships couldn't maneuver. Greek triremes, better handled and crewed by men fighting for their homes, rammed and sank Persian vessels all day. Xerxes watched from a throne set up on a hillside above the strait, witnessing the defeat. Persian losses were severe, perhaps 200 ships sunk. With naval supply lines threatened, Xerxes withdrew to Asia. He left his general Mardonius in Greece with an army of perhaps 120,000 to complete the conquest overland. The final decisive land battle came at Plataea in 479 BCE. The Greek allied force was the largest ever assembled. It numbered perhaps 38,000 hoplites plus light infantry and cavalry, facing Mardonius's force of 70,000 to 100,000 strong. The battle was confused and poorly coordinated on the Greek side, nearly disastrous at several points. But the Spartan phalanx, when it finally engaged, was simply unstoppable. Mardonius was killed in the fighting. Tradition says he was killed personally by a Spartan warrior named Arimnestus. With their commander dead, the Persian force collapsed and fled. On the same day, the Greek fleet defeated the remaining Persian naval force at the Battle of Mycale on the Ionian coast. In a single day, the Persian expeditionary force effectively ceased to exist as a military threat. The Persian Wars had consequences that rippled through everything that followed. Athens emerged as the preeminent naval power. Through the Delian League, it became the de facto hegemon of the Aegean world. The League's treasury, initially on Delos, was moved to Athens, where Pericles used it to fund the construction of the Parthenon. Sparta emerged with its reputation as the finest land army confirmed, but with ambivalence about further eastern involvement. The Spartans wanted the borders of Greece defended. They didn't want a maritime empire. The stage was set for a conflict between Athens and Sparta that would ultimately be far more destructive than anything the Persians had done. Athens has beaten the greatest empire on earth. It's about to enter its most dazzling era, the Golden Age. Art, philosophy, theater, architecture, the greatest minds of the ancient world, all flowering at once in one small city. But underneath that brilliance, something was rotting. The same genius that built the Parthenon would also engineer Athens's complete destruction, and it would use democracy to do it. Don't go anywhere. The mid-5th century BCE is called the Golden Age of Athens. The dominant political figure of this era was Pericles. Never a king, never a tyrant, always technically just one elected general among 10, Pericles dominated Athenian politics for roughly 3 decades. From the 460s until his death in 429 BCE, he shaped the city's character more than any other individual. Pericles was an aristocrat who championed radical democracy, a combination that might seem paradoxical, but wasn't. He deepened Athenian democracy by introducing payment for jury service, making it possible for poor citizens to participate in the legal system. In 451 BCE, he passed a law requiring both parents to be Athenian citizens. This was a narrowing of citizenship. It reflected Athens' sense of its own specialness and created enormous complications for elite Athenians who had married foreign women. The Parthenon, completed in 432 BCE, was Pericles' monument to Athenian greatness, built with Delian League tribute money. It was designed by Ictinus and supervised by Phidias, who also created the massive gold and ivory statue of Athena inside. The Parthenon was covered with sculptural friezes and pediment groups depicting battles between gods and giants, Greeks and Amazons. These were mythological stand-ins for the Greek victory over Persia. The Acropolis building program also included the Propylaea, the monumental gateway, and the Erechtheion with its famous porch of the Caryatids, and the Temple of Athena Nike. These buildings represented both a genuine aesthetic achievement and an advertisement for Athenian imperial power. What made 5th century Athens truly extraordinary was not its architecture or its empire, but the density of intellectual talent it produced. In a century, a tiny city of 40,000 male citizens produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the 3 most influential philosophers. It also produced Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, the founders of Western drama, Thucydides, who invented scientific history, Hippocrates, who founded scientific medicine, and attracted figures like Herodotus, Anaxagoras, Protagoras, Zeno, and dozens of others. Part of it was the wealth of empire flowing into Athens, creating leisure for intellectual activity. Part of it was the competitive, argumentative culture of democracy, which valorized rhetoric and reasoning. Part of it was the Athenian tradition of public performance. Tragedy, comedy, and philosophical debate all took place in public. The sophists, professional teachers who charged fees to teach rhetoric and argumentation, arrived in Athens in the mid-5th century. Protagoras famously declared that man is the measure of all things, a statement that implied that truth might be relative. This was deeply disturbing to traditional religious and moral sensibilities. Socrates' response to the sophists was to agree that conventional wisdom was unreliable, but to insist that rigorous questioning, the Socratic method, could arrive at genuine truth, or at least awareness of one's own ignorance. Socrates wrote nothing. We know him entirely through the dialogues of Plato, his student. Whether Plato accurately represents Socrates' views or uses him as a mouthpiece for his own philosophy is one of philosophy's oldest open questions. Plato's theory of forms shaped Western philosophy, theology, and mathematics for over 2,000 years. Plato's Academy, founded around 387 BCE, was the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Aristotle, Plato's most brilliant student, was in many ways his philosophical opposite. Where Plato distrusted the senses, Aristotle was a relentless empiricist who classified everything he could observe. His biological works classified over 500 animal species and remained the most sophisticated zoological texts for nearly 2,000 years. His Nicomachean Ethics and Politics established frameworks for thinking about human virtue and political organization. Greek theater was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was a civic and religious institution. Tragic performances were held at the festival of Dionysus, funded by wealthy citizens who competed to sponsor the best productions. Aeschylus invented what we recognize as theater. He added a second actor, making dramatic dialogue possible. His Oresteia trilogy traces the cycle of vengeance in the house of Atreus, from the murder of Agamemnon to the establishment of the first Athenian law court. Sophocles added a third actor and wrote over 120 plays, of which 7 survive. Oedipus Rex is still the template for dramatic irony. Euripides was the most controversial and modern of the three. His characters were psychologically complex, his women dangerously powerful. Aristophanes' comedies were bawdy, politically savage, and deeply funny. His plays, Lysistrata and The Clouds, Commerce, Silver, and the Foundations of Economic Power. Athens' cultural golden age was funded by extraction. The silver mines at Laurion, worked by tens of thousands of enslaved people, generated enormous revenues for the Athenian state. Athens also controlled the grain trade routes from the Black Sea, essential for a city that couldn't feed itself from local agriculture. The Piraeus, Athens' port city, connected to Athens by the famous Long Walls, was one of the busiest commercial hubs in the Mediterranean. Merchants from across the Greek world, from Phoenicia, Egypt, Lydia, and beyond, converged there. Athens had developed a sophisticated financial infrastructure, money changers, money lenders, and maritime insurance equivalents. But the Athenian economy was also fundamentally built on slavery. Perhaps a third of the population of Attica were enslaved people, used in mines, agriculture, domestic service, craft workshops, and even as public servants. The Athenian democracy and all its intellectual achievements were made possible by an enormous enslaved labor force that had no political rights. The conflict between Athens and Sparta had been building for decades. Athens' growing empire had alarmed Sparta. Its control of the Aegean, its interference in the affairs of other city-states, its high-handed treatment of Delian League allies. Corinth, with commercial interests directly threatened by Athenian expansion, was particularly aggressive in demanding Spartan action. The trigger was a dispute over Corcyra, a strategically located island that had quarreled with its mother city Corinth. Athens allied with Corcyra, Sparta mobilized. Pericles reportedly said that the war was inevitable once Sparta had made its demands. Pericles' strategy was elegant and, in retrospect, almost suicidal. Athens would avoid pitched land battles. Instead, use its naval supremacy to raid the Peloponnesian coast, deny Sparta access to seaborne commerce, and wait for Sparta to tire. The Athenians and their rural neighbors would all withdraw inside the Long Walls whenever the Spartan army invaded Attica. The strategy might have worked. What it couldn't account for was plague. In 430 BCE, a devastating disease swept through the overcrowded city. Athens may have lost a quarter of its population. Pericles himself died of it in 429 BCE. After Pericles, Athenian democracy began to exhibit its fundamental weakness, susceptibility to demagogues. Politicians promised more than they could deliver, exploiting popular emotion rather than reasoned argument. The most dangerous of these was Alcibiades, brilliant, charming, utterly without loyalty. In 415 BCE, Athens voted to send an enormous armada to conquer Syracuse in Sicily. The plan was to open a second front against Sparta's ally, gain access to grain, and break Sparta's back. It was the greatest military blunder. The expedition was plagued by divided command and inadequate intelligence. Just before the fleet sailed, the Hermae were mutilated. Alcibiades was blamed and defected to Sparta. The Athenian force became bogged down besieging Syracuse. A Spartan general organized the defense. One commander, Nixius, delayed fatally due to a lunar eclipse, interpreting it as a divine omen. The entire fleet was trapped in Syracuse harbor. It was a complete military disaster. The 7,000 Athenian survivors were worked to death in the limestone quarries of Syracuse. Athens never fully recovered. The loss of manpower, ships, and treasure fatally weakened it. Sparta, bankrolled by Persian gold, built its own fleet and finally defeated Athens at sea. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The long walls were demolished to the music of flutes. The Athenian Empire was dissolved. An oligarchic junta, the 30 tyrants, terrorized Athens. Socrates, who survived the war, was tried and executed in 399 BCE, officially for impiety, but widely understood as a settling of democratic scores. Athens had fallen. Sparta controlled Greece. But Spartan dominance lasted barely 30 years. Thebes destroyed Sparta at a single battle. Out of this chaos, a boy grew up in Macedonia, reading Aristotle's lessons, studying campaigns, dreaming of conquering the world. His name is Alexander, and he is about to do exactly that. Greece entered a period of exhausted, shifting hegemonies. Sparta dominated briefly, then overreached. Thebes under Epaminondas ended Spartan supremacy. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, he shattered the Spartan phalanx for the first time. But Epaminondas died at Mantinea in 362 BCE, and Theban power died with him. Into this exhausted, divided Greece stepped Macedonia, a kingdom in the north. Most southern Greeks regarded them as semi-barbarian, ruled by a warrior monarchy. Philip II came to power in 359 BCE, inheriting a fractured kingdom. What Philip accomplished in the next 20 years was extraordinary. He reformed the Macedonian army, developing the Macedonian phalanx, using the sarissa to extend its reach far beyond Greek armies. He created a professional standing army and developed advanced siege technology. Philip used diplomacy and bribery as readily as force. He famously said a mule loaded with gold could breach any city's walls. He expanded Macedonian territory steadily southward. In 338 BCE at Chaeronea, his combined force defeated the Athenian Theban army. The 18-year-old Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry on the left wing. He drove his cavalry through a gap in the Athenian line, rolling up the Greek position. It was the military debut of the man who would conquer the world. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE at his daughter's wedding. Alexander, at 20, became king. Alexander's Persian campaign was a revenge mission, but also something far more personal. A young man raised on the Iliad, tutored by Aristotle, determined to outdo every predecessor. He crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE with approximately 32,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry. His first act on Asian soil was to go to Troy, pour libations on Achilles' supposed tomb. The first major battle was at the Granicus River in 334 BCE. The Persian army tried to stop him. Alexander attacked directly across the river, personally leading the companion cavalry. The second great battle came at Issus in 333 BCE, where Alexander faced Darius III himself. Terrain saved Alexander. The narrow plain neutralized Persian numerical advantage. Alexander attacked the Persian left center, broke through, and drove directly toward Darius's position. Darius fled, leaving behind his mother, wife, daughters, and treasury. Alexander's treatment of Darius's captured family was notably honorable by ancient standards. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate successor to Persian kings, not just a conqueror. After Issus, Alexander moved south along the Levantine coast to secure his supply lines before pursuing Darius inland. Most Phoenician cities submitted peacefully. Tyre, located on an island half a mile offshore, refused. Alexander decided to take it. The siege of Tyre is one of the great feats of ancient military engineering. Unable to bring his siege equipment to bear on an island city, Alexander built a causeway, a mole, from the mainland to the island. It took 7 months. Tyre's defenders set fire to his siege towers with a specially designed fireship. Alexander rebuilt them. He assembled a fleet from surrendered Phoenician cities and blockaded the harbor. He eventually breached the walls in 332 BCE after one of the most technically sophisticated sieges in ancient history. The city was taken, 8,000 defenders were killed in the final assault, and 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The causeway Alexander built, sedimentation has since widened it, is still there. Tyre today is a peninsula. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. At Memphis, he sacrificed to the sacred Apis bull. He was crowned pharaoh, immediately presenting himself in the traditional Egyptian idiom of divine kingship. He visited the oracle of Ammon at the oasis of Siwa, deep in the western desert. What the oracle said was never publicly disclosed, but he emerged believing he was the son of Zeus Ammon. He founded Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile in 331 BCE, choosing the site himself. Alexandria would become the greatest city in the Mediterranean world and the center of Hellenistic science, scholarship, and commerce. The final reckoning with Darius came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE on an open plain in Mesopotamia. Darius had chosen the ground deliberately, a flat, level field where his cavalry could operate freely and his scythed chariots could charge. The Persian force was enormous, including war elephants, scythed chariots, and cavalry from across the empire. Alexander had roughly 47,000 men. The battle was Alexander's tactical masterpiece. He moved his entire line obliquely to the right, threatening to move off the prepared ground and neutralize the scythed chariots. When Darius extended his left wing to counter this, a gap opened. Alexander drove his companion cavalry through it. Again, Darius fled. The Persian army, left leaderless, broke. The empire was effectively over. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, then Susa and Persepolis. At Persepolis, he burned the great palace, possibly in deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens, possibly in a drunken moment he later regretted. Darius III was murdered by his own satrap Bessus in 330 BCE as Alexander pursued him eastward. Alexander tracked Bessus down, had him captured, mutilated, and executed in the Persian royal manner. He was now styling himself King of Kings and adopting elements of Persian court ceremony that horrified his Macedonian companions. The eastern campaigns through modern Afghanistan were the hardest of Alexander's career. Guerrilla warfare in mountain terrain against Bactrian and Sogdian chieftains. Alexander was wounded multiple times. He founded numerous cities as garrison colonies across the region. He also married Roxane, daughter of the Bactrian chieftain Oxyates. In 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus into northwestern India and won his last great battle at the Hydaspes River against King Porus, who commanded a force that included 200 war elephants. The battle required new tactics. Macedonian horses were terrified of elephants. Alexander had to maneuver his cavalry around the flanks, while his infantry dealt with the elephants using specialized weapons. After the Hydaspes, Alexander's army simply refused to go farther. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. The monsoons were beating down. Rumors spoke of even larger empires beyond the next river. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander argued, raged, sulked in his tent for 3 days, and then turned back. The return journey through the Gedrosian desert was catastrophic. Thousands died of thirst and heat. Alexander arrived back in Babylon in 324 BCE, reorganizing the empire, planning further campaigns. In June 323 BCE, after a banquet and heavy drinking, Alexander fell ill. He died 12 days later, at age 32. The cause of his death has been debated ever since. Typhoid fever is the current leading medical hypothesis. He left no designated successor. When asked who should inherit his kingdom, he reportedly said, "The strongest." His body was preserved in honey and eventually interred in Alexandria, where his tomb became a shrine. Alexander conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India by age 30, but he left no heir, no plan for succession. Was he ultimately a great ruler or a great destroyer? What defines greatness, what you build or what you leave behind? Alexander is dead at 32. His generals are already murdering each other. The largest empire ever assembled is about to tear itself apart. But from the wreckage, something new is born, a world that is neither Greek nor Eastern, but a radical synthesis of both. A world of 700-foot lighthouse towers, mechanical water pumps, steam-powered devices, and the greatest library ever assembled. The Hellenistic world is coming, and Rome is watching. Alexander's death triggered 40 years of nearly continuous warfare among his generals, called the Diadochi, successors. These men had commanded Alexander's armies, absorbed his tactical genius, and shared his imperial ambition. None of them was willing to serve another. All of them wanted the whole empire for themselves. The wars were extraordinarily violent and complex, involving shifting alliances, mass defections, and battles. Perdiccas, who had the best legal claim as regent, was murdered by his own officers in 320 BCE. Antigonus, the most capable and aggressive of the successors, was killed at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, a battle that featured 75,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, 480 war elephants, and over 100 scythed chariots on one side. By about 280 BCE, the dust had settled into three major successor kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy V, who hijacked Alexander's funeral cortege to take the body to Egypt; the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Mesopotamia, founded by Seleucus I, which at its peak controlled more territory than Alexander; and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece, which maintained influence over mainland Greek city-states. What the Diadochi's wars created was the Hellenistic world, a vast Greek-speaking civilization stretching from Egypt to Afghanistan. It blended Greek culture with traditions of Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, and India. This period represents one of history's most creative cultural fusions. The Ptolemaic capital Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the world. The Library of Alexandria was a systematic attempt to collect all human knowledge. At its height, it held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Scholars were paid to study and write. The museum was the world's first research university. The achievements here were staggering. Eratosthenes, around 240 BCE, calculated Earth's circumference to within 1% of the correct value. He did this by measuring the sun's angle at noon in Alexandria versus Aswan, using just a stick and a well. Euclid wrote his Elements, the systematic exposition of geometry, around 300 BCE. It remained the standard mathematics textbook until the 19th century. Archimedes of Syracuse calculated pi, developed the lever and pulley, invented the Archimedes screw, and designed war machines. He reportedly made a working model of the solar system. Legend says a Roman soldier interrupted him working on a mathematical problem. Hero of Alexandria designed the Eolipile, a steam-powered rotating sphere, which was, in principle, the world's first steam engine. He also described vending machines, automatic doors for temples, and a programmable cart. The technology existed for an industrial revolution. What didn't exist was an economic and social incentive to pursue it. With abundant enslaved labor, there was no pressure to mechanize. The Hellenistic kingdoms created something genuinely new, a vast, interconnected commercial network stretching from the Mediterranean to India and Central Asia. Alexander's conquests opened trade routes to the east. Luxury goods like spices, silks, gems, and exotic animals flowed westward. Meanwhile, Greek wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods flowed east. The Seleucid Empire was a crucial intermediary. Antioch on the Orontes became one of the largest cities, a polyglot commercial hub. The Ptolemaic kingdom used the Nile to transport Egyptian grain to Mediterranean markets, generating enormous revenues from export duties. The Ptolemies standardized weights and measures and maintained a stable currency. The tetradrachm was the dollar of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. The Hellenistic age produced new philosophical schools. Understanding them means understanding the psychological dislocation of the period. Classical Greek philosophy focused on the polis, how to be a good citizen, and structure the ideal city-state. But the polis was marginalized by Macedonian conquests. You were no longer a citizen of Athens, but a subject of a vast, impersonal monarchy. The new philosophies focused on the individual and how to cope. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, sought ataraxia and aponia. True pleasure came from simple things: friendship, conversation, bread and water. The gods had no interest in human affairs. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, argued that virtue was the only true good. External circumstances were irrelevant to a well-lived life. The universe was governed by a rational principle, and all events were predetermined. The Stoic sage remained indifferent to pain, loss, and death. Cynicism, associated with Diogenes of Sinope, argued for the radical rejection of social norms, wealth, and status in pursuit of virtue. He famously told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight, demonstrating the irrelevance of social convention. Skepticism, associated with Pyrrho of Elis, argued that certain knowledge was impossible. The wise response was suspension of judgment. While the Hellenistic world flourished in the East, a new power was rising in the West that would ultimately prove unstoppable. Rome. Rome systematically conquered the Italian peninsula through military force and sophisticated alliance management. This gave Rome an unmatched manpower base. Rome first encountered the Greek world militarily in the Pyrrhic War, 280–275 BCE. Tarentum invited King Pyrrhus to defend them against Rome. Pyrrhus defeated Rome twice, but at such enormous cost that he reportedly said, "One more such victory and I am lost." Eventually, Roman resources overwhelmed his force, and he withdrew. Southern Italy fell to Rome. Rome's entry into Eastern Mediterranean affairs came through a request for help. Smaller Greek states, frightened of Macedonian power, invited Roman intervention. Rome, with strategic self-interest and commitment to Greek freedom, was happy to oblige. The Second Macedonian War ended at the Battle of Sinoskephalae in 197 BCE. Roman legions under Flamininus defeated Philip V of Macedon. The Roman legions' flexible units exploited gaps in the phalanx. When the legions rolled up the flanks, the Macedonian formation collapsed. At the Isthmian Games of 196 BCE, Flamininus made an extraordinary announcement. Rome was declaring all Greek cities free. The crowd roared so loudly that birds fell from the sky. It was magnificent propaganda. The Greeks did not yet understand Roman freedom meant Roman hegemony. The Third Macedonian War ended at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, one of antiquity's most decisive engagements. The uneven terrain caused gaps to open in the phalanx. Roman legionaries poured into these gaps, destroying the formation. The Macedonian king Perseus was captured. Macedonia was divided into 4 republics and stripped of its silver mines. In 148 BCE, Macedonia became a Roman province. In 146 BCE, Rome razed Carthage and sacked Corinth, Greece's wealthiest city. This was a pretext to end Greek insubordination. A synchronicity of destruction marked this era. The sack was comprehensive. Men were killed, women and children enslaved. Legendary art treasures were shipped to Rome. Mummius warned contractors about damaged statues, showing his lack of understanding for art's true value. Greece became the Roman province of Achaia. This marked the end of Greek political independence. Cities maintained traditions, but the era of the independent polis as a sovereign actor in the Mediterranean was over. Rome slowly absorbed Eastern Hellenistic kingdoms. The Seleucid Empire fragmented due to wars and Parthian pressure. Pergamon was willed to Rome in 133 BCE. Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom, survived longest as a client state. Cleopatra VII's alliance with Antony was defeated at Actium in 31 BCE. Egypt became a Roman province. With Cleopatra and Antony's suicides, the last Hellenistic kingdom passed into history. Greece was conquered, but it conquered its conquerors. Romans were obsessed with Greek culture. They collected art, studied philosophy, staged plays, and learned Greek, absorbing traditions. Horace wrote, "Captive Greece captured her savage conqueror, highlighting its enduring influence." This influence is not merely historical, it is present and operating today, pervasive yet invisible. Democracy. The word and concept are Greek. Modern democracy draws on the idea of consent and participation. Legitimate government derives from the governed. Written law should constrain power. US Constitution framers were steeped in classical history. Senate, citizenship, checks and balances traced to Greek ideas. Philosophy. The categories in which Western philosophy thinks were largely defined by Plato and Aristotle. Questions philosophers still debate. What is knowledge? What is justice? What is the good life? What is the nature of reality? These are the questions the Greeks asked first. Science. The Hippocratic tradition is the foundation of Western medicine, with natural causes and observation. Euclid's geometry is still taught. The Archimedean principle is used by naval engineers. The scientific method itself descends from Aristotle's empiricism, filtered through Hellenistic traditions, art and architecture. The temple form is reproduced in the Lincoln Memorial and the Pantheon. Thousands of courthouses, banks, and government buildings worldwide use Greek architectural elements. Greek dramatic structure underlies Western storytelling from Shakespeare to Hollywood. Language. Enormous swaths of English and other European languages consist of Greek roots. The alphabet itself, through Roman and Etruscan adaptations of Phoenician script, is Greek in ancestry. Most remarkable is not the specific answers, but the questions they asked and how they asked them. They established the principle that questions should be answered by reason and evidence, rather than by authority and tradition alone, even questions about gods, state, and reality. They also established, through bitter experience, that this commitment to questioning is fragile. Socrates was executed by a democracy for asking too many questions. The Library of Alexandria was burned, its contents lost. Hellenistic tradition preserved by Islamic scholars. The Greek experiment in self-government lasted, in its most radical form, barely 2 centuries. It was undermined from within by competitive individualism, inability to cooperate, and demagogues. It was extinguished from without by Rome. But the idea survived. Every generation since has returned to it, to argue about democracy, philosophy, science, and justice. The Greeks are not past, they are ongoing. They came from nothing, from Dark Age villages, subsistence farming, and oral poems around campfires. They fought wars that should have destroyed them, surviving by tactical genius. They created, in a few brilliant centuries, the foundation for virtually everything we value today. Then they fought each other into exhaustion, made catastrophic decisions in assemblies. They were outcompeted by a harder, more patient, sophisticated civilization that learned from them. The Parthenon has been a Greek temple, a Christian church, a Muslim mosque, and a Turkish powder magazine. It has been in ruins for 335 years and is still the most beautiful building in the world. Greece gave us the tools to ask questions that matter. It gave us a warning. Even the greatest civilization can destroy itself from within. It gave us proof that ideas, not armies, empires, or gold, are genuinely immortal. And that brings us to our final question for you. We've watched the Greeks invent democracy, philosophy, science, theater, and the examined life, then lose everything to Rome. Given their rise and fall, what is the most important lesson modern civilization should take from the Greek story? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end of this dive into Greek history, you are exactly our kind of person. Subscribe, share this with someone who loves history, and we will see you next time.